Hello, fellow humans. Even though it's been a week and a half since I finished this book, I will try and review it anyway. It's called Thin Air by Michelle Paver. I'm afraid I can't show it to you because I left it at uni, but it's a kind of ghost story thriller type book. It's written in a kind of famous five style, quite posh and gung ho and very, very English, but it's also a ghost story and it's a modern book. It's only came out last year. I probably wouldn't have bought it if I hadn't been to see its author Michelle Paver at a talk because when I was about 13, I was a big fan of her series Chronicles of Ancient Darkness. It's about a boy and a wolf. It's great even if you're not a child. I mean, it's a children's series. I was probably too old to read at 13, but I would recommend it. It's very original, a lot more original than this book actually. And she was selling her book at this talk, and I mean, I didn't have to buy it, and being a uni student, I probably shouldn't, but I kind of felt guilty for not buying it because um, she used to be an author I was a fan of, and I'd been to a talk 2 days before by a really shit poet, and I did buy his book, so I thought I should probably buy the book this time. The story of Thin Air is about a group of mountaineers from the 1930s, led by Dr. Stephen Pierce, who is a medical specialist who has been assigned to their team very swiftly. It's a bit of a cliche, the last minute replacement as the main character, but this cliche is in here, is in this story. And the leader, well, not the leader, but the kind of prominent personality of the expedition is his brother, who's a kind of stereotypical boisterous posh boy with no moral code and is a bit of an arsehole. But the rest of the people in the expedition are quite likeable. And as they go up the mountain, Stephen starts experiencing strange supernatural tendencies, and apart from some vague hints that the others might be, it's mostly just him. So, as I think, I haven't read it, but similarly to what I've heard of from her other ghost story, Dark Matter, Thin Air has ambiguity as to whether Stephen is imagining the supernatural things. The book was a very enjoyable one. I recommend it wholeheartedly. The writing is quite kind of, I mean, I haven't actually read Famous Five, but you know what I mean when I say Famous Five-esque. Quite gung-ho, very, very British, quite posh, adventure-y. Even though Michelle Paver does kind of take the piss out of that style later on when most of the characters worship this mountaineer called Lyell, whose expedition also went horribly wrong. And he's a kind of pompous, racist, old British stereotype who kind of sees public school boys as the master race. So maybe the style is partially ironic, but the narrator, despite this style, is very likable. He's a compassionate person. I would describe him as suspiciously modern in his attitudes towards most things, because it's a modern book. Although he does kind of view the people in the Himalayan foothills who help them as kind of inferior to the white man in a way. Kind of, he's not an actual racist, but he does look down on them because of his society. But no more than anyone else would, and probably less by the end of the novel. He kind of respects them more than his own country people because of events that happened to him. And I've got on a bit of a tangent now. Anyway, as I was saying, good readable style, very readable. I got through it very quickly. Mostly likable protagonist. And as I said, the other characters are likable as well, apart from his arsehole brother. I'll get to that later. The main source of tension in the novel is probably the mountain itself. I felt it was more a book about mountaineering than about anything supernatural. The sheer size and scale of the mountain is scary in itself, but the conditions they have to live in and all the threats of certain death, the isolation, there's so many things. It really made me want to read like non-fiction about mountaineering, or maybe even watch a documentary and see what it's actually like for people. I mean, it kind of felt like an elaborate obstacle course in a way, like it made me want to try it, but at the same time, I mean, especially when they set up camp on the edge of sheer cliffs, and if they just kind of walked a few feet in a snowstorm and didn't see it, they would die. I think they didn't need the supernatural element because the main source of tension in the novel was how these conditions affected them psychologically and physically, because there's always a threat of death, even without any supernatural beings. In fact, I'd go so far as to say the supernatural element of the novel is probably its weakest. Stephen, the protagonist, sees a lot of dark figures standing on cliffs. There's a backpack that moves at one point, but it's all very minimalist, and I suppose in certain circumstances this would frighten people. I mean, minimalist horror is supposed to be the scariest, and I suppose I can kind of see what they mean. I mean, the Beast in Doctor Who scared me a lot more than any of the big evil creatures like the Daleks or anyone, because he didn't really exist. There was a voice and some symbols on the wall, and it was all fucking terrifying. But Michelle Paver's not particularly good at doing this. Nothing she actually presents seems scary out of the context of mountaineering, and it's not like this can do any harm to the main character. I mean, he describes the dread that comes along with these things, but it's difficult for us to empathise because supernatural things, I assume, don't actually exist, as far as I know. I'm not a believer in the supernatural, but I'm open-minded to the possibility. So no one can really empathise with the feelings of dread that come along with seeing the backpack move or seeing the hunched figure. So it's really difficult not to ask, well, why is he scared? I mean, obviously, a hunched figure shouldn't be up on the mountain, and it's something supernatural, because nothing can live up there. But that doesn't necessarily mean it can do him any harm, and it can't. All the things are psychological tricks, and if he just didn't pay any attention to the psychological tricks, he probably would have been fine. So it's his own fault. And that's maybe more of a rant on ghost stories in general than this specific one, but I feel like the mountain is scary enough in itself without the supernatural element, although people probably wouldn't read without the supernatural element because it's billed as a ghost story on the cover. But that is my opinion, and I am reviewing it, so take that. I said I was going to get back to his brother, and I am going to do that now. Okay, so the main conflict emotionally in the book, other than the ghost story, is between Stephen Pierce and his brother, who is a boorish, racist idiot, and arguably the main antagonist of the book, because the rivalry between him and his brother kind of warps their emotions a bit. I feel like there's a case of unreliable narrating, because Stephen always says his brother can't stand it when he's successful, and I suppose the evidence we see makes us believe that, but because it's a first-person narrative, it's not necessarily true. And maybe the emotions that tie into him and his brother being rivals leads to him being more easily prey to the ghost. And I think this element of the novel is what elevates it a bit and makes it a more interesting one. That said, there's nothing really interesting about this novel. It's a very fun read, but nothing here jumps out as groundbreakingly original or phenomenally good. I think I'll give it a B for enjoyment, but a C as a kind of proper grade. I feel like I can't really give this a higher grade than Ulysses, because that would just become an insult to literature. Ulysses is clearly the better book, even though it wasn't as consistently enjoyable. And to be honest, this was a bit anticlimactic, and I didn't enjoy it that much. So yeah, a C probably is the best grade for it. I should probably have a script, but you get to see my decisions in action. Yay!